Hello again, everyone. And as you can see, Fiona and I have two guests with us this morning, two people who have appeared regularly on Scottish Independence podcasts. And welcome, Isobel and Bill. The background to this, the past few months have been these anti-immigrant, racist, even you might say fascist demonstrations going on, most of them in England, one in Belfast, I think, as far as I'm aware, none in Wales, and one which happened just a few days ago in Glasgow in Scotland. So Bill contacted us and said, how about we just talk about what's been happening in these riots, what's behind them. And I remember, Bill, you said very, very clearly to me, look, this isn't about being triumphalist because most of them, dreadful violence has happened in England. So it's not about being triumphalist, but at the same time, there is a difference, though, isn't there? So what might that be, and what might what might be behind that?
It's a sensitive issue, clearly, and there is a difference. Clearly, there's been a difference, and there was a demonstration that took place on Saturday. The other side, if we'll call it that, because I'm not quite clear if we can give it a name. And the demonstration, I thought, went very well. The other side were down towards the cenotaph side. They were very small in number. Most people in the supportive side, as we'll call it, were focused on the stage and the various contributions coming from the stage, and so that actually was quite good. And it was a broad range of Scottish society. I would say there, Cocab Stewart spoke as part of the government. Pauline MacLeod spoke as a Labour politician as well, and there was a lot of representatives from the trade union movement. The unions in particular turned out in force, and that was good to see, and you would expect that anyway.
So, as I say, I'm here representing the RMT. You can see my good friends to the Fire Brigade Union, PCS, Unite, UCU, PCS, Unison, whole gambit of the trade union movement is here because we understand what it's all about. We all came from somewhere else, and as I say, the people at the back are still coming for the dark ages, but the rest of us living in an enlightened society are here to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, stand in solidarity with people being racially abused, and making it clear we will not accept that.
In Germany we see the AfD, in France we see Marine Le Pen, in the US we see Donald Trump, in Italy we see Meloni, a fascist prime minister, and here in Britain, people from Nigel Farage to the Glasgow cabby in Glasgow to his hero Tommy Robinson, they want to replicate that. That's what they want to bring to the streets of Britain, to our communities, to our workplaces and to our parliaments. Don't tell me, please, that this cannot happen in Scotland. We just had a general election in which Reform UK, a far-right party, got 7% of the vote. 160,000 votes, too many for a far-right party.
The anti-immigration protest on the other side of the square was called by the Glasgow cabbie Steph Shaw and supported by a think tank group called A Force for Good. Wonderfully named because, they do such a great job winning pay rises, securing rent controls, fighting inequality, building community. Oh wait, no, that's not them. It's all of us here. And the Glasgow cabbie who wants his protest to be peaceful, there is no peaceful way to say that you don't want me in this country. Right? If they can hear me, I want them to know being anti-immigration is as sensible as being anti-breathing. People have moved freely since the dawn of time. Creating sad AI images of Union Jacks doesn't tangibly improve anyone's quality of life.
But, why different? It's not exceptionalism. These issues are in Scotland, but not to the same extent. I spoke to a lot of people on Saturday, and I put this comment to one or two others who have been around in the anti-racist movements, and I said to them, I wonder to what extent the Orange Order has had a dampening effect on this, because leaving aside Northern Ireland, which is very different, and the riots in Northern Ireland, which were very different, was very different. I'm not equating the Orange Order with the other side, so to speak. But because it's been around as an institution for a very long time, one wonders to what effect it's had a dampening effect on that, because I wouldn't think it would be in any way formally involved with anything that was going on the other side. And I want to make that clear. I'm not suggesting it. But Scottish society is in a sense quite distinctive. And there are some institutions been around for a long time, and I've got links in some communities where some of these things, some of the things could emerge, if you want to put it that way. I don't want to put too much on it, but I think that might have had some sort of influence. And also, and I think this is a fair point, Scottish political culture is, to some extent, a bit to the left of what I'll call English political culture. And in that sense, there is a different sort of identity. And also there is different iterations of English identity. Some of them, like Billy Bragg's, are quite positive, but there are others who are less positive. And you even see people like, and I consider him, he's not my cup of tea by any manner of means, but you get the likes of David Starkey, who thinks that Englishness is disappearing into a sort of Britishness, if you see. So there is something there. But behind it all, I do believe that it's about economics. It's about communities that are facing poverty, a modicum of breakdown. As I was mentioning in our pre-conversation there, Danny Dorling's book, Shattered Nation, touches on a lot of this, because Britain itself is shattering. If you look at poverty indices in Britain, it's worse than anywhere else in Europe. If you go to Europe of 1975, Britain was up there with the Nordic countries. Indeed, in the 1970s, politicians, academics, civil servants from the Nordic countries were coming to Britain to look at why it was one of the most relatively equal societies in Europe. Now it's one of the most unequal societies in Europe. And I think that some of that shattering that Dorling talks about is behind the rioting that we saw down south. And the rioting was, as rioting often is historically, desperation. You go back in history, you go back to even the medieval period, and you have revolts and riots because of sheer inequality. Not to an extent greater than today, but we're starting to see an inequality really seep in and affect communities. I really think that's what lies at the bottom of it. And also some mainstream politicians using that.
Yeah, yes. We can think of one he's mainstream now, isn't he? Farage.
And Farage, by the way, he was on Question Time 37 times before he was elected. When you consider the number of councillors the Greens have had in England for about a decade, and you consider the lack of representation on Question Time, and then when you take Farage and his people and their representation at local level has been minuscule compared to the Greens, and yet Farage was a staple on Question Time. A lot of these narratives have been promoted wittingly or unwittingly, just as clickbait or just trying to get numbers. But I'm sure that is an important factor. And the fact that the concept "the boats" is now creeping into even Labour narratives, using the term "the boats."
As you said, inequality, and just to pick up on the Question Time, it goes out on the BBC. You would hope that BBC have some kind of editorial awareness that at some point they'd say, "Oh, why is Farage on so often when other people are not?" Of course, when Farage is on, you can be almost certain that you're going to get sound bites that will go all over media, and then maybe it is to do with viewing numbers, although I'm hoping that's not too cynical a view of BBC editorial policy. So it seems to be there's also a feeling of powerlessness. Yes. People, rightly or wrongly, cynical about politicians. So then if you end up impoverished, feeling powerless, and then not trusting or beginning to not trust your politicians, that's a recipe for the kind of, outburst, because, it has to go somewhere, doesn't it? That sort of, whether it's resentment, anger, whatever, blaming somebody else.
Yeah, I think we've got really two strands here that you really need to look at in relation to not just the riots, but the political behaviour as well. One of them is the historical development of English nationalism, how it developed. It could have gone in a quite different way, but it didn't. And the other are the social and economic issues. And these kind of two strands coming together, I think, has produced quite an explosive mood in terms of political behaviour. I don't mean necessarily explosive in the violent sense, some of it may be, but also in terms of the erratic nature of how people may behave. But the English nationalism, with no doubt at all, as it emerged through late 19th, through much of the 20th century, with some periods when it seemed to go veer in a bit of a different direction, say round about the Second World War. But it was about triumphalism, imperialism, we are the top dogs. And it wasn't that it wasn't there in Scotland, but there was another story about the nation in Scotland that counteracted it to a considerable extent. But in the context of England, you could have go back to the Tolpuddle martyrs, go back to all the campaigns for political and economic rights. There was a different history there, but that is not the history that predominated in the mainstream story as it emerged. There's a whole discussion there about why did that story emerge and not the other story. And there we're talking about power structures and media and so on.
Really interesting, that point you're making, because that to me was one of the differences I noticed between coverage of the riots in England and what happened in George Square. Yeah. The George Square one was badged as a pro-UK event, which has already got constitutional implications for us. Also, if you look at the vision of them, there was a few English Cross of St. George, yes, but most of it was Union Jacks. And that huge big stop the boats Union Jack. No boats coming into Glasgow. This is quite clearly an English concern that's been brought up. And the other thing that was quite striking of that event was the reports of how many people were being bussed up from the north of England. So this wasn't a homegrown. Yeah. It was something that was imported from the country next door, largely. And you've got to wonder whether that thing you're describing, the kind of power and display and colonialism and imperialism, that's what they're doing.
It's just very sad that so many of the working class in England were fed over the generations with the image, but you're important because we're the big imperial power in the world. We control Africa, we control India and much of Asia and so on. And they were fed this by the upper class. That became ingrained in a lot of their identity. Now, in the Scottish case, yes, there was, of course, that identification with imperialism up to a point, but there was the other story. I mean, when you consider the huge, what shall we say, Burns phenomenon in the 19th century, the emergence of Burns clubs and statues and all of that, that was telling Scots a very different kind of story that they wanted to identify with. And similarly, the whole Red Clydeside, that was so much part of it. The Highlands and the terrible treatment of the ordinary people, that was ingrained into a Scottish identity, and there wasn't really the equivalent in England. So when we jump to the present day, you've got the sad remnants of people wanting to cling to this English identity of global importance and superiority. they want it because they feel it's part of their identity, and it's disappearing, it's disintegrating. But you combine this with the situation of not just poverty, but it's the collapse of so many of the institutions around which communities were based. The whole Thatcher collapse of manufacturing, of so much of industry, and the centralisation of economic power, the dominance of in the British system of the financial institutions, and as a result, people have and what was done on housing. I mean, where before, and we have to come back and say we've got elements of that in Scotland too, where before people had communities that were at least based on a bit of security around housing, and so much of that has gone for people. So you get all these failures and insecurities, and of course that's intensified a bit post the Osborne austerity years, and that creates this atmosphere where you're looking for the scapegoat. Now, the thing in Scotland is that the scapegoat hasn't been about people, hasn't been about minorities in Scotland. It has been around the British state has failed, and Scotland could do so much better. So it's been put in a mainstream kind of political direction. It's not been focused towards minorities. And in fact, I mean, Bill mentioned the Orange Lodge. That anti-Irish, anti-Catholic feeling, I mean, that was coming from the central belt of Scotland. That was very, very alive when I was younger. And, you know, I can remember even through my career, you know, as a university lecturer, sometimes you had students from England, a number of US students and so on, and they would they would ask me sometimes, students here, they're very interested in asking you which school you went to.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Were you middle class? Did you come from a private school? I said, oh, no. They just want to find out were you Catholic or Protestant. It would be rude to ask you. So much of that has gone.
Indeed, and Tom Devine done some really good work on institutional sectarianism and attitudinal sectarianism, and the paradox is that Thatcher's deindustrialisation removed some of the structural stuff. But I want to go back just to one other point that to deal with it, because I think some critics in the left in Scotland, particularly younger people, will bring this up, and I think it needs to be addressed and dealt with, and it's Scotland's role in the imperial project.
Yes.
Scotland bought into it, you know, hook, line and sinker. The upper classes and the business classes of Scotland benefited from that hugely. You only need to walk around the city of Glasgow and take your eyes off the ground level shops to see the glory of the imperial architecture in Scotland. I mean, first of all, also going to say the role of Scots in slavery was, you know, industrial brutality and bestiality, you know, on a scale that's an immorality of it is just absolutely unforgivable. And there was a lot of Scots in the Americas that were involved in that. So I'm not trying to say there weren't Scots involved in that. But again, I'm actually going to come back to Starkey because I don't like the man. I listened because he had a thing about, you know, the deconstruction of England. I thought that's an interesting idea because he is one of the prominent Tudor historians, and I did a bit of Tudor history at university, and that tells you something about the Scottish University History Department in the 1960s. You know, I was able to do more about the Tudors than I was able to do about the Stuarts, but there we go. He more or less says that Scotland benefited from the imperial project, no doubt, but the impact of the end of the imperial project that Isobel's talking about has been more keenly felt in England than in Scotland, because Isobel was talking about the development of the Scottish cultural institutions, a Scottish story in the 19th century, Burns. But I think the point about that deconstruction of support bases for England in its small towns. Paul Mason, who's disappeared off the scene to some extent, and has went in with the new the Starlight Project. Apparently, I remember a few years ago he was talking about how, he gave an example of where certain racist narratives would appear in the pub. Then the local trade unionists would challenge that because they were part of the fabric.
I'm not sure too, if we think about the religious institutions in Scotland, who of course were much more powerful up until the last 2-3 decades. The Church of Scotland, on the one hand, yes, it bought in to the imperial story up to a point, but I think there was always something of a trend there underlying in the church. If you even look at David Livingstone, now I find it shocking that some people class Livingstone amongst the Victorian imperialists and all that. As someone who lived in Hamilton, not too far from Livingstone Memorial, and was used to being taken along and seeing the story and seeing the very close relationships Livingstone had with the Indigenous people, and his quite courageous battles against the local slave owners. This is an egalitarian story as far as race goes, and it's a personal story there of extreme poverty, but rising through education. So these were other of the big myth figures, if you want, real but mythical in how they were absorbed into the culture. So I don't think the imperial thing in Scotland was quite as racist, quite as demeaning towards traditional cultures and so on, as it was perhaps in some of English culture, including Church in England. Now, that's a very broad generalisation, and there are plenty of exceptions.
Yeah.
But in terms of the Church of Scotland, I think there's a strong positive strands in there as well as negatives when it comes to colonialism. The other thing some people have suggested, I'm not quite sure about the validity of this, was that the Scottish attitude towards the empire was much more transactional.
We've just been recording an episode about the 1820 uprising, the Radical Wars. And part of that, well, one of the discussion points we got to was the Scots who were transported to Australia as part of their punishment, and that they actually were quite welcome in Australia because they were skilled, they were literate, they were weavers, they were printers, but also they went there, and the governor of Australia at the time was a Scot. He was replaced by another Scot. The person who started off the bank was a Scot. It really was a land of opportunity as far as Scots as part of the fabric of the empire. But the thing that struck me, just as you were talking there, I mean, as common with most Scots, half of my family were cleared, and that process, and about 4/5 of them ended up being put on boats going to Canada and Australia because they'd been cleared off their land. The other half came down and became part of industrial Glasgow, but the other half, off they went. So I think that whole connotation, I don't know that there's a parallel in England with your relatives being put on boats, forcibly ejected to another country, and I think that's possibly where this idea of stop the boats and, oh no, the threat of these immigrants, we are those immigrants.
Yeah.
I can bring in here perhaps the role of the growth of the SNP and how interesting that is, or has been, both in terms of the reduction of prejudice in Scotland, of the dominant prejudice of that time, but also of giving people a different kind of future, a different kind of story. When the SNP made its biggest initial breakthrough with Hamilton, with the huge growth of membership and branches in the late 60s onwards. And by the way, there are so many commentators who have kind of almost forgotten about the 70s. And looking at SNP membership round about the 60 odd to 70k now, I would say that is fairly similar to probably what the SNP membership was in the mid-70s, but there were far more branches then. And even the spurt in membership after Hamilton was huge. Don't know if the figures were very accurate, but it was huge. Anyway, that's beside the point. But I think the period that came was the period, as you remember, of the heightening of the troubles in Northern Ireland, and the violence and all the events which led to the growth of the IRA activity and the violent activity, as opposed to the human rights strand in that movement. Now, in many ways, the west of Scotland, well, not just the west, central Scotland, could have been a bit touch and go at that time, because you still had very strong Catholic Protestant tensions that were there. And they could, some things might have triggered them. And the trouble with violence is a spiral. As soon as it gets triggered, and then you get revenge, and then you get revenge, it can readily get out of control. Now, the interesting thing there is just at that time, you had the big growth of the SNP, the big growth of the idea of independence. And that channeled so much political energy in that positive direction. Now, I don't know if Scotland would have gone down into that hellish pit of intercommunal violence. Perhaps we looked across the water and thought, oh God, let it not happen there. But it could have. It wasn't out of the question. But the fact that the whole discourse in Scotland changed so much in that period, and the whole emphasis came to be on a Scottish identity, not a sectional identity, I think ensured that did not happen in Scotland, and that we moved further and further away from the sectarian tales and prejudices that had been a significant part of our society. And it was a very real part, because I did research work, because I was involved in doing industrial research work. But one of the things that I found was just how real the sectarian divide was. And we're talking here into the 70s, late 60s, into the 70s. And in one well-established old Scottish engineering company, it wasn't the kind of thing I was exploring, but I found it was being fed to me that, oh no, there are no Catholics in here above semi-skilled, because you'll never get an apprenticeship if you're Catholic. You will not even get a foreman who isn't in the Masons. But then I went to a big American company doing research there, lots of interviews, and I found out, gosh, this religious thing is coming out here, but in the other way around. There were lots of people saying, it's very hard to get a job in here now if you're not Catholic. Now, I took this all to be prejudice, except I came back a year later just to do a bit of follow-up with managers. And I wondered, why am I not dealing with the same personnel? Chief, and he said, well, we had to have an investigation because there were some complaints, and we looked at all the stats, and we had to accept that the accusations of bias were accurate.
Wow.
So, it just shows in that period, in mainstream big companies, this was still real. But the good thing is it diminished. Some, as Bill says, some of the diminution came from the fact that the big sources in the shipyards and others, with that going, so did quite a lot of the core basis of some of the prejudice. But it wasn't just that, but the growth of the independence movement, I think, fundamentally changed all.
It's interesting because Isobel was one of the key figures in the early, the modernising of the SNP. I don't think I've ever said this to her face before, but many of the time I've been in conversations with people and saying the modern SNP, that is the modern SNP that became a mainstream political party, was down to the likes of Isobel Lindsay and a few others like her. There was a pivot away from the Labour Party, partly to do with the nuclear issue. And I think the role of the nuclear issue, as well as the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, the fact that they're militarily balmy, there's all of that. There's a rational case to get rid of nuclear weapons. But underpinning that, there is the fact that it occurred in Scotland, it led that there was some cultural dimensions to that as well, in the modernising of the SNP that Isobel was involved in. And I first joined the Scottish National Party. I mean, Isobel was actually a lecturer at Strathclyde when I was there as a student. And as someone who joined as a rookie in the 70s into the 80s, while Isobel was one of the leading figures, I think it's really interesting in that shift and the impact, the cultural impact of the Scottish National Party, the cultural impact of independence. When I first became a trade union activist in the early 80s, the leaderships of the unions were looking over the shoulder at the Scottish National Party, looking over the shoulder at independence, were very nervous about it, and now a lot of them have come to accept it, actually, although the independence movement, paradoxically, is still to catch up on that. That modernising impact is really important, and that dissolution of the sectarian element, the structural sectarianism that Tom Devine talks about. I mean, I went to university when I was about 21. I'd been in retail. I'd managed to go through night school. I'd managed to go through a full grant to Langside College, all down to a Tory Prime Minister, actually, Macmillan, I think it was, who put in place the structures that are the financial structures that allowed me as a working class boy to go to further education college to upgrade my hires, to go to university, put in place by Macmillan, and then deconstructed by Tony Blair. I think that's an interesting story as well. But that pivot that Isobel's talking about towards independence did see off some of the more baleful influences that were emerging elsewhere. And we're even seeing it today, because look what's happening in England, but look what's happening in Europe recently. I mean, look what's happened in Germany and in France. And I think the SNP is guilty of intellectual laziness here. I think Brexit was an exercise in economic self-harm. No doubt about it. But until recently, we'd see people going about with the European flags. Well, the European project is in trouble because the European centre has been missing in action, and they've allowed the right to grow in Europe. And that's an important factor as well. We've not seen that in Scotland, but that's down to the independence movement, and it's a very inclusive, positive movement. Well, we're seeing in England, and we're seeing in Germany, and we're seeing in France, and we're seeing in other parts of Europe that the European project is under real tensions and is failing. And some SNP politicians who've spent their careers extolling the virtues of Europe, have been a bit lazy, and they should be starting to talk about why the European project is starting to disintegrate. And I think that's an important part as well, because the growth of independence and its iteration of Scottish nationalism has acted as a bulwark against that as well.
Going to Reform UK getting a toehold in Scotland as well. I mean, we were just talking the other day that under the Holyrood system, it's likely we're going to have more than one Reform UK MSP.
Well, that's true.
That's a dreadful direction.
Well, it is indeed, but we're still 10 years behind the French and the Germans and others in this. I mean, they're getting the Americans a toehold, but remember that the reason they're getting the toehold is because Reform UK, which is a limited company, spent millions and lost deposits. They bought, and the political system in Britain is meant not to allow. You're not meant to be like America where you can buy television time. But because Reform UK bought effectively hundreds of lost deposits, spending millions of pounds, it gave them a platform in the general election, and they are there. And it comes back to this point about the mainstream media giving Farage and others, a play. But you're right. I mean, that we're now facing the challenge of Reform UK. How's that going to play out in the Tory party? How's it going to play out in the list? Yeah. What is it going to do to Alapa? What is it going to do to the SNP? That is something that we need to start to face up to.
Do you think that bulwark is strong enough to,
No, I think there's an ideological case to be made for going after wealth taxes. We really need the SNP. The days of being 3.5 degrees to the left of Labour, which has been the story of the Scottish National Party in the 40 years of being a member, won't do. It won't do. Relying on Rachel Reeves, inverted commas, to deliver austerity budgets for the next 2 or 3 years isn't good enough. And just saying, well, we're better. We're 3 or 4, we're 3.5 degrees to the left of Labour. That'll do.
Even worse than that, they're saying, oh, well, nothing we can do about it. Yeah, they're going to slash the winter fuel. Yeah.
The SNP at our conference, we passed a motion for the trade union group. And we have a position where it's time for the Scottish National Party to look at wealth taxes, to look at reforming the local government finance. It's now party policy, actually, but one of the challenges is the Scottish government going to, how seriously is it going to take the policy that became party policy, just a week and a bit ago? That's a challenge for us in the SNP to promote that, to build alliances around that within the Scottish National Party, particularly among parliamentarians and others, because that agenda, that needs to come onto the agenda. The SNP needs to be seen to be getting growls back from the wealthy. We need to be seeing the wealthy in the Herald, for instance, slagging off some proposals around about rent controls and stuff like that. It's time for the Scottish National Party to be in a position where the Scottish Whisky Association is worth 35 billion a year, not the 10 billion or 5 billion the SNP politicians talk about. It's 35 billion. It's time for the SNP to start to draw fire from big whisky, not the distilleries that are craft distilleries, but big whisky and the landed interest. When the landed interest, big whisky and others start shooting at the SNP, the Scottish public will start believing what we're saying about wealth taxes.
Yeah, I think that's right. And
I don't know how much research there has been done in Scotland. I haven't seen on those because it's very recent who have voted Reform UK. But I think they come into two categories. One is disillusioned Tories, so taking that from the Tory vote. But the other is just people who are a small minority of people who are very, very angry. There are lots of people who are very, very angry, but only a small minority in terms of the actual numbers who see this as the way of expressing anger. And there may have been people who were SNP voters, possibly Labour voters or whatever, but they're just angry. So we are dealing with that. But yes, there is no feeling, and the trouble is time is so tight, so limited, that the SNP is anything other than part of that establishment. And there is this failure to act. on so many critical issues, and the excuse being, oh, well, we haven't got the legal powers, or we can't do this. Now, there are many organisations, I'm obviously on the board of Commonweal, for years we've been producing practical explanations as to the kind of things you can do within existing powers that are really quite radical. Not enough, but significant. So the information, the knowledge, all of that has been there. It's just there's been a reluctance to move away from the safe confines of the civil service advice and all the lobbying big institutions and commercial concerns advice. They won't move away too far from that. They'll do a little bit of fiddling. They'll do an expression of intent. But there hasn't been that backbone for serious, sustained action, picking on some central reforms that have to take place in Scotland.
Do we think that is going to change between now and 2026? Because I think you're absolutely right. And I can see the SNP not being in power just because of inertia or perceived inertia.
Circumstances are going to force that. Back to Danny Dorling and in the shattered nation of the United Kingdom, slightly less shattered than Scotland, according to Dorling. The decline has been like that, if I may, like that since '79. For the last 2 or 3 years, it's been like that. Now, when you're into that sort of decline, when you're into that sort of gradient, it becomes a spiral, and that's what Dorling and others are talking about. Now, the SNP has been able to sort of manage that sort of decline and put out stories, and under Alex Salmond as well. Alec did the same sort of thing. So the idea of, shall we say, showing a bit of ideological ankle, if I can put it that way, was, if it was learned by Nicola Sturgeon and the subsequent First Ministers, they learned it at the knee of Alec. The idea of showing a bit of ideological ankle, but not too much. And ALPA, by the way, said in exactly the same boat. ALPA may have differences with SNP over cultural issues, but when you look at it in economic issues, I discern no great difference, apart from being 2 or 3 degrees to the left of the SNP, who are a few degrees to the left of Labour. Apart from that paradigm. So we need, in that sort of gradient, politics changes. I think politics has changed in the last 2 years with the crises in the NHS. It's less so than in England. The crises in education, less so than in England. And some of the things you read in the Herald, they're just at it. But that sort of decline, that spiral, has an impetus all of its own. And I think this time next year, in 2025, that spiral is going to cause further challenges, so that we'll have to be faced up to. Though there is one warning, there's a poll today out which says that Labour and the SNP neck and neck for the Holyrood elections, and that's with Starmer's deliberately performative austerity. So there's no guarantee that being 2 or 3 degrees to the left of Labour is going to hack it. It's not going to work. And there's a lot of thinking that has to be done within my party in relation to its economic policies. Grow the economy. Rachel Reeves, grow the economy. The economy's always grown, albeit anemically to some extent, yet inequality has massively, there's a chasm. While the economy has grown, there's been a chasm. So how much does the economy have to grow before trickle-down economics becomes a flood? Because it's not going to happen. So when politicians within the Scottish National Party talk about grow the economy, it's not good enough, because that's precisely what Rachel Reeves is saying. And in that sense, that sort of just sloganising, grow the economy has got a shelf life. And when you're in a decline like that, particularly when the economy is growing, it's not going to hack it electorally. It's not going to have much electoral salience.
Yeah, I want to see the out tax, OWT, obscene wealth tax, and start making obscene wealth and hoarding of resources be an actual insulting bad thing to apply to somebody, because it is obscene. The differences, and unless we're willing to actually say we don't agree with that level of greed, at the expense of ordinary people, then
right at this moment, party policy, leaving aside government policy, which is somewhat different at times, and that's the way things are. SNP party policy in economics has never been so aligned to the STUC as it is at this moment. But Composite A that was passed at Congress in April and the motion that was passed by party conference on economic issues have never been more aligned, and the party needs to take advantage of that. And that was an olive branch deliberately by the STUC. Part was aimed at the new Labour government, and part was aimed at the Scottish National Party, aimed at their two spaces deliberately to try and get them to come on board. And the SNP needs to, there are allies within the trade union movement right now, right at this moment in time, that the party needs to take advantage of.
Wow. Well, we've covered some ground this morning, haven't we? Great conversation as always. It's always a pleasure to have you two on.
I was been really taken, Isobel, by you sort of bringing in that, the fact that the SNP going back to the 70s, has had on the kind of things that we're talking about, assumptions that people make, and maybe been able to, provide a bit of bulwark against, what's happening down south and elsewhere. Just to finish up, one of the things that I came across just this morning, actually, it's a clip. It's actually on the BBC website if anyone wants to go and get it. But it's a clip, and they just went round. They just sort of obviously asked a question to people at that demo on Saturday. So there's one in Glasgow, but there was also one outside Holyrood, and they were obviously just asking them a question like, "Why are you here?"
To make people maybe feel more welcome and safer in Scotland.
The hostile regime against, brown and black people and immigrants is not on, and we won't have it, certainly in Glasgow, with its history of socialism and inclusion. So we just had to come down today to show solidarity and
just to protest against something that should have been away from the world already a long time ago, but hopefully it will change at some point. I think everyone should be welcome. It's not worth pointing finger at your neighbour.
Refugees are welcome here. Just because we need to stand up, it's wrong what's happening, and any little voice can help. So, we'll win this. They won't win.
And I just felt it was uplifting because the answers were, I want people to feel safe in Scotland. I know I'm just one voice, but I'm here because if we all put our voices together, then we can stop this. Just ordinary people. It wasn't the politicians up on the stage, and I'm not saying they shouldn't have been there. It was good that they were, but it was just ordinary folk walking round Holyrood and walking round George Square and saying, "This is why I'm here." And I just feel it's uplifting, actually.
And I think this importance of the stories that people tell each other and tell themselves, you kind of get to forget which decade. I think it was 80s into the 90s, and doing some research on national identity and getting people to express in their own words about what do you feel Scottishness is, what do you... Now, it was so interesting there, and it might have been different 20, 30, 40 years before, but what was coming out was this sense of Scottishness was being about fairness, down to earth, ordinary working people, and there were a lot of positives there. And perhaps we can see this in terms of what has happened to our Tartan Army football supporters.
Yes.
They have become so proud, having had a bad reputation some decades ago, they have become so proud of being good, so proud of being the friendly people. And now there was a small project that we did just in Birmingham, just looking at, again, some perceptions of Englishness. And one of the interesting things is that the English were struggling to find things to say about Englishness that weren't kind of a bit trivial, It was as if they were a bit confused, about their identification. The Scots had no difficulty in saying things about what they thought Englishness was, and snobbishness and, the class identification. That came in, and it was just at a time I thought this is really a bit fair, a bit smug, when quite a number said football hooligans.
I was reading an article it was yesterday afternoon, and it was, because we just lost a football match in Portugal.
Yeah.
And in the article, they were just saying that the Tartan Army takes a collection, and it looks for somewhere locally to where they're playing to give that money to.
Yeah.
And so they were talking to Portuguese journalists for asking for suggestions. And I thought, wow, that's brilliant. And actually, it's exactly what the Yes Stones people do.
Yeah,
When they go around the marches and they put stalls up, they take a collection, get donations, and it's given to a local charity. So it's the same mindset, isn't it?
That's right. It's people's diplomacy.
Ambassadors.
I think we should have a programme at some point on the idea of a people's diplomacy, because that's brilliant. That's really brilliant. And maybe that's what we should be doing anyway around Scotland and out with. Thanks both of you for coming on.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah.